Hello again, guys. Let's continue. Get my pipe lit. Got some Bayou Morning, not the flake. Flake is my favorite. Once again, some more Parnassus on wheels. Chapter 9. My feelings were as mixed as a crushed nut sundae. So the professor hadn't gone to Brooklyn, after all. What did he mean by prowling after me like a sleuth? Was it just homesickness? Homesickness for Parnassus? Not likely. Then the horrible noises I had heard in the night. Had some tramping hanging about the van in the hope of robbing me? Had the tramp attacked Mifflin? Or had the Mifflin attacked the tramp? Who had got the better of it? I picked up the muddy cap and threw it into the van. Anyway, I had problems of my own to tackle, and those of the professor could wait. Peg whinnied when she saw me. I examined her foot. Seeing it by daylight, the trouble was not hard to diagnose. A long, jagged piece of slate was wedged in the frog of the foot. I easily wrenched it out, heated some water, and gave the hoof another sponging. It would be all right when shod once more, but where was the shoe? I gave the horse some oats, cooked an egg and a cup of coffee for myself at the little kerosene stove, and broke up a dog biscuit for Bach. I marveled once more at the completeness of Parnassus' furnishings. Bach helped me to scour the pan. He sniffed eagerly at the cap when I showed it to him and wagged his tail. It seemed to me that the only thing I could do was to leave Parnassus and the animals where they were and retrace my steps as far as the Pratt farm. Undoubtedly, Mr. Pratt would be glad to sell me a horseshoe and send his hired man to do the job for me. I could not drive Peg, as she was with a sore foot and without a shoe. I judged Parnassus would be quite safe. The lane seemed to be a lonely one leading to a deserted quarry. I tied Bach to the steps to act as a guard, took my purse and the professor's cap with me, locked the door of the van, and set off along the back track. Bach whined and tugged violently when he saw me disappearing, but I could see no other course. The lane rejoined the main road about a half-mile back. I must have been asleep, or I could have never made the mistake of turning off. I don't see why Peg should have made the turn, unless her foot hurt and she judged the sidetrack would be a good place to rest. She must have been well used to stopping overnight in the open. I strode along, pondering over my adventures, and resolved to buy a pistol when I got to Woodbridge. I remember thinking that I could write quite a book now myself. Already I began to feel quite a hardened pioneer. It doesn't take an adaptable person long to accustom oneself to a new way of life, and the humdrum routine of the farm certainly looked prosy compared to voyaging with Parnassus. When I got beyond Woodbridge and had crossed the river, I would begin to sell books in earnest. Also, I would buy a notebook and jot down my experiences. I have heard of bookselling as a profession for women, but I thought that my taste of it was probably unique. I might even write a book that would rival Andrew's, yes, and Mifflin's. And that brought my thoughts to Barbarossa again. Of all extraordinary people, I thought, he certainly takes the cake. And then, rounding a bend, I saw him sitting on a rail fence with his head shining in the sunlight. My heart gave a sort of jump. I do believe I was getting fond of the professor. He was examining something which he held in his hand. "You'll get sunstroke," I said. "Here's your cap." And I pulled it out of my pocket and tossed it to him. Thanks, he said, as cool as you please. And here's your horseshoe. Fair exchange. I burst out laughing, and he looked disconcerted as I hoped he would. I thought you'd be in Brooklyn by now, I said. At 600 Abingdon Avenue, laying out Chapter 1. What do you mean by following me this way? You nearly frightened me to death last night. I felt like one of Fenimore Cooper's heroines, shut up in the blockhouse while the redskins prowled about. He flushed and looked very uncomfortable. I owe you an apology, he said. I certainly never intended that you should see me. I bought a ticket for New York and checked my bag through. And then while I was waiting for the train, it came over me that your brother was right and that it was a darned risky thing for you to go jaunting about alone in Parnassus. I was afraid something might happen. I followed along the road behind you, keeping well out of sight. Where were you while I was at Pratt's? Sitting not far down the road, eating bread and cheese, he said. Also, I wrote a poem, a thing I very rarely do. Well, I hope your ears burned, I said, for those Pratts have certainly raised you to the peerage. He got more uncomfortable than ever. Need to relight. Well, he said, I dare say it was all an error, but anyway, I did follow you. When you turned off into the lane, I kept pretty close behind you. As it happens, I know this bit of country, and there are very often some hobos hanging around the old quarry up that lane. They have a cave there where they go in winter quarters. I was afraid some of them might bother you. You could hardly have chosen a worse place to camp out. By the bones of George Eliot, Pratt ought to have warned you. I can't conceive why you didn't stop at his house overnight anyway. If you must know, I got weary of hearing them sing your praises. I could see that he was beginning to get nettled. I regret having alarmed you, he said. I see that Peg has dropped a shoe. If you let me fix it for you, after that I won't bother you. We turned back again along the road. I noticed the right side of his face for the first time. Under the ear was a large, livid bruise. That hobo, or whoever he was, I said, must have been a better fighter than Andrew. I see he landed on your cheek. Are you always fighting? His annoyance disappeared. Apparently the professor enjoyed a fight as much as he did a good book. Please don't regard the last 24 hours as typical of me, he said, with a chuckle. I am so unused to being a squire of dames that perhaps I take the responsibilities too seriously. Did you sleep at all last night, I asked. I think I began to realize for the first time that the gallant little creature had been out all night in a drizzling rain, simply to guard me from possible annoyance, and I had been unforgivably churlish about it. I found a very fine haystack in a field overlooking the quarry. I crawled into the middle of it. A haystack is sometimes more comfortable than a boarding house. Well, I said penitently, I can never forgive myself for the trouble I've caused you. It was awfully good of you to do what you did. Please put your cap on and don't catch cold. We walked for several minutes in silence. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. I was afraid he might have caught his death of cold from being out all night in the wet, to say nothing of the scuffle he had had with the tramp, but he really looked as chipper as ever. How do you like the wild life of a bookseller, he said. You must read George Borrow. He could have enjoyed Parnassus. I was just thinking when I met you that I could write a book about my adventures. Good, he said. We might collaborate. There's another thing we might collaborate on, I said, and that's breakfast. I'm sure you haven't had any. No, he said. I don't think I have ever. I have. I have never I never lie when I know I shan't be believed. I haven't had any either, I said. I thought that to tell an untruth would be the least thing I could do to reward the little man for his unselfishness. Well, he said, I really thought that by this time. He broke off. Was that Bach barking? He asked sharply. We had been walking slowly and not yet reached the spot where the lane branched from the main road. We were still about 3/4 of a mile from the place where I had camped overnight. We both listened carefully, but I could hear nothing but the singing of the telephone wires along the road. No matter, he said. I thought I heard a dog, but I noticed that he quickened his pace. I was saying, he continued, that I had really thought to have lost Parnassus for good by this morning, but I'm tickled to death to have a chance to see her again. I hope she'll be as good a friend to you as she has been to me. I suppose you'll sell her when you return to the Sage? I don't know, I'm sure, I said. I must confess I'm still a little at sea. My desire for an adventure seems to have let me in deeper than I expected. I begin to see that there's more in this bookselling game than I thought. Honestly, it's getting into my blood. Well, that's fine, he said heartily. I couldn't have left Parnassus in better hands. You must let me know what you do with her, and then perhaps when I finish my book, I can buy her back. We struck off into the lane. The ground was slippery under the trees, and we went single file. Mifflin in front. I looked at my watch. It was 9 o'clock, just an hour since I had left the van. As we neared the spot, Mifflin kept looking ahead through the birch trees in a queer way. What's the matter? I said. We're almost there, aren't we? We are there, he said. Here's the place. Parnassus was gone. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10. We stood in complete dismay. I did, at any rate, for about as long as it takes to peel a potato. There could be no doubt in which direction the van had moved, for the track of the wheels was plain. I had gone farther up the lane toward the quarry. It had gone farther up the lane toward the quarry. In the earth, which was still soggy, were a number of footprints. By the bones of Polycarp, exclaimed the professor. Those hobos have stolen the van. I guess they think it'll make a fine Pullman sleeper for them. If I realized there were more than one of them, I'd have hung around closer. They need a lesson. Good Lord, I thought. Here's Don Quixote again, about to wade into another fight. Hadn't we better go back and get Mr. Pratt? I asked. This was obviously the wrong thing to say. It put the fiery little man all the more on his mettle. His beard bristled. Nothing of the sort, he said. Those fellows are cowards and vagabonds anyway. They can't be far off. You haven't been away more than an hour, have you? If they've done anything to Bach by the bones of Chaucer, I'll harry them. I thought I heard him bark. He hurried up the lane, and I followed in a panicky frame of mind. The track wound along a hillside beside a high bank in a forest of birch trees. I think the distance can't have been more than 1/4 of a mile. Anyway, in a very few minutes, the road made a sharp twist to the right, and we found ourselves looking down into the quarry over a sheer rocky drop of 100 feet at least. Below, drawn over to one side of the wall of rock, stood Parnassus. Peg was between the shafts. Bach was nowhere to be seen. Sitting by the van were 3 disreputable-looking men. The smoke of a cooking fire rose into the air. Evidently, they were making free with my little larder. Keep back, said the professor softly. Don't let them see us. He flattened himself in the grass and crawled to the edge of the cliff. I did the same, and we lay there invariably from below. We lay there invisibly from below, but quite able to see everything in the quarry. The three tramps were evidently enjoying an excellent breakfast. This place is a regular hangout for these fellows, Mifflin whispered. I've seen hobos about here every year. They go into winter quarters about the end of October, usually. There's an old, blasted out section of the quarry that makes a sheltered dormitory for them. And as the place isn't worked anymore, they're not disturbed here so long as they don't make mischief in the neighborhood. We'll give them. Hands up, said a rough voice behind us. I looked around. There was a fat, red-faced, villainous-looking creature covering us with a shiny revolver. It was an awkward situation. Both the professor and I were lying full length on the ground. We were quite helpless. Get up, said the tramp in a husky, nasty voice. I guess you thought we wasn't covering our trail. Well, we'll have to tie you up, I reckon, while we get away with this crystal palace of yours, Ewan. I scrambled to my feet, but to my surprise, the professor continued to lie at full length. Get up, Deacon, said the tramp again. Get up, them graceful limbs, if you please. I guess he thought himself safe from attack by a woman. At any rate, he bent over as if to grab Mifflin by the neck. I saw my chance and jumped on him from behind. I am heavy, as I have said, and he sprawled on the ground. My doubts as to the pistol being loaded were promptly dissolved, for it went off like a cannon. Nobody was in front of it, however, and Mifflin was on his feet like a flash. He had the ruffian by the throat and kicked the weapon out of his hand. I ran to seize it. You son of Satan, said the valiant Redbeard. Thought you could bully us, did you? Miss McGill, you were as quick as Joan of Arc. Hand me the pistol, please. I gave it to him, and he shoved it under the hobo's nose. Now, he said, take off that rag around your neck. The rag was an old red handkerchief, inconceivably soiled. The tramp removed it, grumbling and whining. Mifflin gave me the pistol to hold while he tied our prisoner's wrists together. In the meantime, we heard a shout from the quarry. The three vagabonds were gazing up in great excitement. You tell those fashion plates down there, said Mifflin, as he knotted the tramp's hands together, that if they make any fight, I'll shoot them like crows. His voice was cold and savage, and he seemed quite master of the situation. But I must confess, I wondered how we could handle four of them. The greasy ruffian shouted down to his pals in the quarry, but I did not hear what he said. It's just then the professor asked me to keep our captive covered while he got a stick. I stood with the pistol pointed at his head while Mifflin ran back into the birchwood to cut a cudgel. The tramp's face became the color of the underside of a fried egg as he looked into the muzzle of his own gun. I'm going to set the pipe down. Say, lady, he pleaded, that gun goes off awfully easy. Point her somewhere else or you'll croak me by mistake. I thought a good scare wouldn't do him any harm and kept the barrel steadily on him. The rascals down below seemed debating what to do. I don't know whether they were armed or not, but probably they imagined that there were more than two of us. At all events, by the time Mifflin came back with a stout birch staff, they were hustling out of the quarry on the lower side. The professor swore and looked as if he would gladly give chase, but he refrained. Here you, he said in crisp tones to the tramp, march on ahead of us down to the quarry. The fat ruffian shambled awkwardly down the trail. We had to make quite a detour to get into the quarry, and by the time we reached there, the other three tramps had got clean away. I was not sorry, to tell the truth. I thought the professor had had enough scrapping for 24 hours. Peg whinnied loudly as she saw us coming, but Bach was not in sight. "What have you done with the dog, you swine?" said Mifflin. "If you've hurt him, I'll make you pay with your own hide." Our prisoner was completely cowed. "No, boss, we ain't hurt the dog," he fawned. "We tied him up so he couldn't bark, that's all. He's in the bus." And sure enough, by this time, we could hear smothered yelping and whining from Parnassus. I hurried to open the door, and there was Bach, his jaws tied together with a rope end. He bounded out and made super canine efforts to express his joy at seeing the professor again. He paid very little attention to me. "Well," said Mifflin, after freeing the dog's muzzle and with difficulty restraining him from burying his teeth in the tramp's shin, "what shall we do with this heroic specimen of manhood? Shall we cart him over to the jail in Port Vigor, or shall we let him go?" The tramp burst into a whining appeal that was almost funny. It was so abject. The professor cut it short. "I ought to pack you into the quod," he said. "Are you the Phoebus Apollo I scuffed with down the lane last night? Was it you skulking around the wagon then?" "No, boss, that was Split-Lip Sam. Honest to God, it was. He come back, boss, said he'd been fighting with a catamount. Says, boss, you sure hit him hard. One of his lamps is pudding. Boss, I'll swear I ain't nothing to do with it." "I don't like your society," said the professor, "and I'm going to turn you loose. I'm going to count 10. If you're not out of the quarry by then, I'll shoot. And if I see you again, I'll skin you alive. Now get out." He cut the knotted handkerchief in two. The hobo needed no urging. He spun on his heel and fled like a rabbit. The professor watched him go, and as the fat, ungainly figure burst through a hedge and disappeared, he fired the revolver in the air to frighten him still more. Then he tossed the weapon into the pool nearby. "Well, Miss McGill," he said with a chuckle, "if you like to undertake breakfast, I'll fix up Peg." And he drew the horseshoe from his pocket once more. A brief inspection of Parnassus satisfied me that the thieves had not had time to do any real damage. They had got out most of the eatables and spread them on a flat rock in preparation for a feast. And they had tracked a good deal of mud into the van, but otherwise I could see nothing amiss. So while Mifflin busied himself with Peg's foot, it was easy for me to get a meal underway. I found a gush of clean water trickling down the face of the rock. There were still some eggs and bread and cheese in the little cupboard, and an unopened tin of condensed milk. I gave Peg her nosebag of oats and fed Bach, who was frisking about in high spirits. By that time the shoeing was done, and the professor and I sat down to an improvised meal. I was beginning to feel as if this gypsy existence were the normal course of my life. "Well, Professor," I said as I handed him a cup of coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs and cheese, "for a man who slept in a wet haystack, you acquit yourself with excellent valor." "Old Parnassus is quite a stormy petrel," he said. "I used to think the chief difficulty in writing a book would be to invent things to happen. But if I were to sit down and write the adventures I'd had with her, it would be a regular odyssey." "How about Peg's foot?" I asked. "Can she travel on it?" "It'll be all right if you go easy. I've scraped out the injured part and put the shoe back. I keep a little kit of tools under the van for emergencies of all sorts." It was chilly, and we didn't dawdle over our meal. I only made a feint of eating, as I had had a little breakfast before, and also at the events of the last few hours had left me rather restless. I wanted to get Parnassus out onto the highway again, to jog along in the sun and think things over. The quarry was a desolate, forbidding place anyway. But before we left, we explored the cave where the tramps had been preparing to make themselves comfortable for the winter. It was not really a cave, but only a shaft into the granite cliff. A screen of evergreen boughs protected the opening against the weather, and inside were piles of sacking that had evidently been used as beds, and many old grocery boxes for tables and chairs. It amused me to notice a cracked fragment of mirror balanced on a corner of rock. Even these ragamuffins apparently were not totally unconscious of personal appearance. I seized the opportunity while the professor was giving Peg's foot a final look to rearrange my hair, which was emphatically a sight. I hardly think Andrew would have recognized me that morning. We led Peg up the steep incline back into the lane where I had strayed, and at length we reached the main road again. Here I began to lay down the law to Redbeard. "Now look here, Professor," I said. "I'm not going to have you tramp all the way back to Port Vigor. After the night you've had, you need a rest. You just climb into the Parnassus and lie down for a good snooze. I'll drive you into Woodbridge, and you can take your train there. Now you get right into that bunk. I'll sit out here and drive." He demurred, but without much emphasis. I think the little fool was just about fagged out, and no wonder. I was a trifle groggy myself. In the end, he was quite docile. He climbed into the van, took off his boots, lay down under a blanket. Bach followed him, and I think they both fell asleep on an instant. I got on the front seat and took the reins. I didn't let Peg go more quickly than a walk, as I wanted to spare her sore foot. My, what a morning that was after the rain. The road ran pretty close to the shore, and every now and then I could catch a glimpse of the water. The air was keen, not just the ordinary unnoticed air that we breathe in and out and don't think about it, but a sharp and tingling essence, as strong in the nostrils as camphor or ammonia. The sun seemed focused upon Parnassus, and we moved along the white road in a flush of golden light. The flat fronds of the cedars swayed gently in the salty air, and for the first time in 10 years, I should think, I began amusing myself by selecting words to describe the goodness of the morning. I even imagined myself writing a description of it, as if I were Andrew or Thoreau. The crazy little professor had inoculated me with the literary bug, I guess. And then I did a dishonorable thing. Just by chance, I put my hand into the little pocket beside the seat where Mifflin kept a few odds and ends. I meant to have another look at that card of his with the poem on it, and there I found a funny, battered little notebook, evidently forgotten. On the cover was written in ink, "Thoughts on the Present Discontents." That title seemed vaguely familiar. I seemed to recall something of the kind from my school days, more than 20 years ago. Goodness me. Of course, if I had been honorable, I wouldn't have looked into it, but in a kind of quibbling self-justification, I recalled that I had bought Parnassus and all it contained, lock, stock, and barrel and bung, as Andrew used to say, and so... The notebook was full of little jottings, written in pencil in the professor's small, precise hand. The words were rubbed and soiled, but plainly legible. I read this: "I don't suppose Bach or Peg get lonely, but by the bones of Ben Gunn, I do. Seems silly when Herrick and Hans Andersen and Tennyson and Thoreau and a whole wagonload of other good fellows are riding at my back. I can hear them all talking as we trundle along. But books aren't a substantial world after all, and every now and then we get hungry for some closer, more human relationships. I've been totally alone now for 8 years, except for Runt, and he might be dead and never say so. This wandering about is fine in its way, but it must come to an end someday. A man needs to put down a root somewhere to be really happy. What absurd victims of contrary desires we are. If a man is settled in one place, he yearns to wander. When he wanders, he yearns to have a home. And yet, how bestial is content. All the great things in life are done by discontented people. There are 3 ingredients in the good life: learning, earning, and yearning. A man should be learning as he goes, and he should be earning bread for himself and others. And he should be yearning too, yearning to know the unknowable. What a fine old poem is The Pulley by George Herbert. Those Elizabethan fellows knew how to write. They were marred simply by their ideas that poems must be witty. Remember how Bacon said that reading poets makes one witty? There he gave a clue to the literature of his time. Their fantastic puns and conceits are rather out of our fashion nowadays. But Lord, the root of the matter was in them. How gallantly, how reverently they tackled the problems of life. When God had first made man, says George Herbert, he had a glass of blessings standing by. So he pours on man all the blessings in his reservoir: strength, beauty, wisdom, honor, pleasure. And then he refrains from giving him the last of them, which is rest, i.e. contentment. God sees that if man is contented, he will never win his way to life, way to him. Let him be restless, so that if goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast. Someday I shall write a novel on this theme and call it The Pulley. In this tragic, restless world, there must be some place where at least we can lay our heads and be at rest. Some people call it death, some call it God. My idea of a man is not the Omar who wants to shatter into bits this sorry scheme of things and then remold it nearer to his heart's desires. Old Omar was a coward with his silk pajamas and his glass of wine. The real man is George Herbert's seasoned timber, the fellow who does boldly, handily, and well whatever comes to him. Even if it's only shoveling coal into a furnace, he can balance the shovel neatly, swing the coal square on the fire, and not spill it on the floor. If it's only splitting kindling or running a trolley car, he can make a good artistic job of it. If it's only writing a book or peeling potatoes, he can put it into the best he has. Even if he's a bald-headed old fool over 40 selling books on a country road, he can make an ideal of it. Good old Parnassus. It's a great game. I think I'll have to give her up soon, though. I must get that book of mine written, but Parnassus has been a true glass of blessings to me. There was much more in the notebook. Indeed, it was half full of jotted paragraphs, memoranda, and scraps of writing. Poems, I believe some of them were. But I had seen enough of it. Enough. It seemed as if I had stumbled unawares on the pathetic, brave, and lonely heart of this little man. I'm a commonplace creature, I'm afraid, insensible to many of the deeper things in life. But every now and then, like all of us, I come face to face with something that thrills me. I saw how this little red-bearded peddler was like a cake of yeast in the big, heavy dough of humanity. How he traveled about trying to fulfill in his own way his ideals of beauty. I felt almost motherly toward him. I wanted to tell him that I understood him, and in a way I felt ashamed of having run away from my own homely tasks. My kitchen and my hen yard, and dear old hot-tempered, absent-minded Andrew. I fell into a sober mood. As soon as I was alone, I thought, I would sell Parnassus and hurry back to the farm. That was my job. That was my glass of blessings. What was I doing? A fat, middle-aged woman traipsing along the roads with a cartload of books I didn't understand. I slipped the little notebook back into its hiding place. I would have died rather than let the professor know I had seen it. The end of chapter 10. Okay. That's a long one this time. Okay. I'll keep going later on. Bye.